yeah, today's going to be supply and demand. Honestly, I'm going to say that some of this is just going to be a lot of terminology that I'm going to need you to memorize, but we can get to some more interesting stuff at the end, I think. So, let's go. First of all, we're going to talk about, okay. First of all, we want to actually define what a supply curve would be. So let's say again that we have the price here and the quantity here. If you're wondering why the price is up here and the quantity is up here, it's because economists have a terrible habit of writing the independent variable on the y-axis. Albeit for us, this is the x-axis. Although I'll say, really, it's everybody else that has this wrong, because when you're writing this down naturally, you write this down x here and y, because x comes before y, and this is closer to the top left. So really, yeah. Really, everyone else is wrong. So, okay. Now, the supply curve, let's say, oh, that's a great response, thank you. So, the supply curve is just the quantity that that everybody is willing and able to supply of a good, to sell of a good at any given price. So if this is one price and then you have here 100 of this, whatever this good is, right? Then the quantity supplied here is 100, and then here you have a different price and a different quantity supplied, and so on. And each of these is just a different pair of price and quantities that are going to be supplied. The main thing to notice is that when somebody talks about, quote, the supply of a good, they're talking about this whole curve. This is a confusion that sometimes comes up, and sometimes people will, instead, to be very specific, call it the supply curve, albeit it's not strictly necessary. But this is a question that people will get confused a lot. They'll say something like, for example, oh, the price increased, so the supply is going to go up. But the supply itself, this whole curve, is staying right in place. It's just that you're moving to a different point on the supply curve. So this is that's one thing. In fact, it's one of the, if I recall correctly, it's the most commonly missed question on the AP Micro exam, whether increasing the price increases the supply. It's just a bit of terminology. It's not that important. I'll also be if you say the supply when you mean the quantity supplied, I'll probably get what you mean, but... Oh, no. Oh, fuck it. Fuck it, new page. There we go. No. There. Demand curve is basically the same thing, except for how much people are willing and able to buy of a good at any given price. I say willing and able because you have to include both the well, first of all, you need to include the ability, because if somebody says, yes, I would like to buy that good for $1 billion, do you have $1 billion? No. Then it's sort of, first of all, it's not really going to contribute to the actual demand if you go out and try to observe it, right? And the second thing is that then you could sort of say that people are willing to buy pretty much anything, even if they're not willing to spend the money on it. So it becomes sort of useless. It's the demand becomes 7 billion for everything. So let's actually think about how you would find a market demand curve, right? So let's think of just like an individual demand curve. Just one person. This is a market with one person, let's pretend for now. And think about how much they're willing to pay at how much they're willing to buy at any given price, right? So really, when you think about it, the best way to think of an individual demand curve is that this is essentially the marginal utility curve for a person, except that we've changed the units. It's the marginal utility essentially in dollars. Because when you think about it, like if somebody is willing to buy 100 units of a given good, but no more, at a price of, let's say, $1. Because we're making again, like this is going to be a simplified model. We're thinking of people as rational utility maximizers for now, like I went over in the first class. So when we're thinking about people in those terms, then the way that we can think of it is for each of these goods, maybe it'll make a little bit more sense if I make it discrete. So it's instead like a bunch of points. I'll just say it's discrete. So, for example, let's say that up here, a person is asking, should I? Yes, exactly. Cool. Best reaction. Okay. So let's say that up here, somebody's deciding, should I buy another good? The way that a rational utility maximizer decides this is they think, okay, is the marginal utility of how much the price is, like let's say it's $2 up here, is the marginal utility of this good higher to me than the marginal utility of $2, or equivalently just the marginal utility of whatever I would instead buy with those $2, like whatever I would use those $2 for. And if it's higher, then people will if the marginal utility is higher than $2, then they would buy this good. Like they would buy more of this good. They'd keep going down this curve. If the marginal utility is lower, they wouldn't buy it. So what you have now is sort of like at every point, the marginal utility for this good in terms of dollars. Any questions so far? Does this make sense?
I have a question. When we're talking about this, the $2 versus $1 point, it's the marginal utility of the good to that person, and it goes down as the number that you buy increases. So like the n plus one good. I'm just trying to make sure I understand this correctly. The nth plus one good is not necessarily as valuable as the nth good,
Yep,
and that's why you see this curve going in the. It has a slope.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
This is essentially why it has to go down. We're sort of making the assumption, which I want to point out, can be loosened up in an intermediate class with more math and yes, that's actually we're going to go over that when we talk about over price discrimination, Leotal. That's going to be in the monopolies section. Yep. But yeah, that's a great observation. Okay. So, any other questions?
So it slopes downward. I'm not sure I follow that it slopes downward because the of diminishing returns of utility. Like is this what any individual customer demands then, rather than what customers as a whole demand?
Yes, that is like what right now we're talking about, like one individual. This is
I
an
see.
individual demand curve. And then we're going to go over
Okay.
how you get a market demand curve from individual demand curves. So to everyone, it makes sense that the individual demand curve is the same as the marginal utility in dollars. Does that make sense?
Yep.
No.
No?
Yes, I said yes.
Oh, you said yes. Okay, I thought you said no. Okay. Okay, then. In that case, let's say... Okay, so then let's imagine now that you have a bunch of these individual demand curves and you're wondering, okay, how do I get the total demand curve? And the answer is actually, it's... So to go over that, first we need to talk about the different kinds of goods that there are. So there's two big types of goods and then two smaller, less common ones that I'm not going to talk about as much. So they are private and public goods. So the idea behind a private good is that it has two really big distinguishing features, and the public good is just not that. So the first is that they are rivalrous, which means just that if somebody consumes one unit of this good, for example, if somebody eats a waffle, then I cannot also eat that waffle. I'm not going to wait, at the very least. It's just some good that only one person can use. Or if you're thinking about a computer, it's not possible for like two people to be on it at the same time, really. So there's competition over these goods. And the second key feature is that a private good is a, what would you say, what's the term again? Rivalrous and non-excludable, excludable. So the second thing is that you can just keep somebody else from using a public good if they don't pay for it. If somebody manufactures a computer and you say, hey, I want to use that computer, then they can just say, okay, pay me money or else no. And so it's easy to stop somebody from using a private good if they don't pay for it. If you don't have these characteristics, so the example that's often given is a road in old times, like in medieval times, let's say, and this is just meant to be. So yeah, that's a good example, Leotal. Your chair is a private good and sunlight is a public good because I can't stop you from using sunlight, and it's not rivalrous. Like if you use the sun, it doesn't stop me from being able to use sunlight. But I will say that usually when we're well, actually, yeah, that's a good example. So now there are two other categories of goods that are sometime that usually get like sort of papered over and people pretend they don't exist. The first one is common goods, and this is the phrase "tragedy of the commons" that you've often heard. It's a good that is rivalrous, but not excludable. So the old example was just that in medieval times people would have a big a square of land in the middle of the city that everyone was allowed to graze sheep on. And so there was no exclusion, everybody could use it, but there was still a rivalry for it because the first person to put their livestock there and get the livestock to eat all of the grass was screwing it all up for the next guy. So that's one example, and then the final example is what's called a club good. So this is something that is not rivalrous, but is excludable. And in fact, even though roads are sometimes given as an example of a public good, I would say that they're really a better example of a club good, because when you think about it, you can exclude people from a road. Just put like a big toll booth at the front of it, and that's it. You're done. But at the same time, if the road isn't very congested, then if it is fully congested, like there's a lot of traffic on it, then it becomes a private good. But if it's not good, if it's just like a small road in a rural town, for example, that barely gets used and there's no problems with it, then it is really a better example of a club good. Because if one person using it doesn't hurt someone else. And it is still excludable, though. You could put a big toll at the front of it if you wanted.
So wouldn't traffic make roads rivalrous?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So then actually, despite being
I think the point
called... Sorry,
would be that as traffic increases, the rivalrousness also increases. If you can't do price discrimination like congestion pricing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And this is also the fact that some roads end up in the private category up here is why I think that a lot of roads should probably be privatized. But we can about why why private goods will sometimes be better for the market to handle, and public goods should definitely be done by the government later. So let's think about again, let's go back to this. Let's say that you just have a private good. So, for example, donuts. And we have a bunch of individual demand curves. We know that Johnny here is this is his demand curve, this is James's, this is Jenny's, and so on. So how would you get the full market demand curve? Somebody want to give an answer?
Is it addition?
Yes, congrats. But addition how?
Addition how? I want to add up the sum of the curves.
Averaging over the curves?
Not averaging. What you want is to add up the curves, but quantity-wise. You want to add up the quantity. Yes, exactly, Leotal. Add quantity for every fixed price. So, for example, here you want to add up, like if this is a quantity of 1, this is a quantity of 2, this is a quantity of 3, then you want to add them up so that you get a quantity of 6 at this same price of, let's say it's 1. Yeah, because economists are so creative in their exercises. Yeah, this is this is why I warned you. This is horrible. It's cursed. I'm disgusted. It makes more sense when you get to private goods, though. To public goods, though. And then you would just add them up the same, and then you would get like one big demand curve like this. By adding them up horizontally, quantity-wise. So, on the other hand, now let's say that you have a private good. A public good, right? How would you get the total demand curve for all of society? Somebody want to take a guess?
So it's the other way?
Sorry?
We have already all of the individual demand curves of all of society.
Yes.
We do the same thing, but for longer.
The problem is that you can't quite add them up quantity-wise. I think that was about to say this. You have to add them up price-wise, and the way to think of this total demand curve isn't as a quantity that people are actually going to buy if you set a price at this place. The best way to think of it is as the sort of demand that society, like as a whole, has for this. If you imagine that all of society was just one really big person, it's the way this is that then this is the marginal utility curve for all society, right? Because then if there's a marginal utility of here at a quantity of 1, there's a marginal utility of $1 and then $2 and then $3, then the marginal utility for everyone, because remember, everyone gets to use this good. It's non-rival risk in consumption. It's something like sunlight or a road that anybody can use and won't get congested. So that just means that you add up the marginal utilities because everyone is using it and they're all getting the same utility as they were before out of it. Does that make sense? So this is sort of just like a marginal utility curve for all of society.
Wait, why aren't you just adding Q for fixed P?
The reason why you can't do that is because it doesn't... Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so the reason why you can't just add Q for fixed P and you have to add up the marginal utilities instead is that if you try to do that, you will sort of get a... So you'll get the private good demand curve, but more importantly, it's that, or the actual explanation is that if you try to do this, you're essentially saying at this price of like 1, for example, then this person is going to buy one of this good, and then this person is going to buy one of this good, and then this person's, or sorry, 2 of this good, and this person's going to buy 3 of this good. But that's not going to happen, because the thing is that, remember, everybody can use it. It's something like a public road. So as soon as this guy buys, like, for example, 3 units of road, this guy's buying 0 and this guy's buying 0. Because this
I
guy's
see.
already bought 3 units of road, you can just use his units of road, especially because it's not excludable. He can't stop you from using them. That's why if you have these 2 categories together, it doesn't make sense to add up wise. And that's also why it doesn't make sense to think of this total demand curve then as the quantity that people are going to buy at any given price, right? It's better to think of it as a marginal utility curve for all of society. This is what you could, like, if everybody, like, in a society came together in a big room and said, okay, this is how much I'm willing to pay, this is how much I'm willing to pay, and so on, and you added all of their willingnesses to pay, like, you added all of them up, you would get this curve, which describes sort of the marginal utility of a unit of, like, maybe this is road at any given quantity. So does that make sense?
Well, but sure, but their willingnesses to pay are not independent of everybody else's willingness to pay. Like, because it's on the margin, like you said. So I don't really see the analogy.
No, they're actual, because we're talking about at a fixed quantity, right?
Sure.
So we're saying at this quantity at 1, then this person's willingness to pay is 3, right? And this person's willingness to pay is 2, and this person's willingness to pay is 1, because we're saying
I see.
everybody gets 1 unit of road, right? So we can add up all of what they're willing to pay to get what society as a whole is willing to pay, like the benefit that they would get out of it. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, and all of this was for a public good specifically?
Yes. Private is a more common example. We're mostly going to talk about private goods. But so everyone gets both private and public goods how to do this?
Oh, sorry. So you were the first edition of adding quantities at fixed price, that was private?
Yes. Because at a quantity.
Okay. And
Yeah.
and if it's a public good, then you add prices at fixed quantity. Or did I not follow that?
No, you got that. That's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. So, and the thing that I'm not going to. I don't know if I'll have time to go to equilibrium, but then the thing that I definitely will is. Oh, has anyone heard the term elasticity before?
I have
Yeah.
heard of it.
Okay. Elasticity, just a measure of how flexible demand is to. So when let's say we have a demand, then at any given price. Oh, can you guys? Hello. Can you hear
Kind of
me?
cutting out. Now I think so.
Okay. That's okay. That's good. Okay. So we have this at every given price, and as mentioned, so let's think about now the derivative of the demand curve. So P dq. Very often they prefer, or instead of the price with respect to, it could be either one. They're both derivatives of the curve. And what we're talking about now, though, is the price elasticity of demand. So how, God damn it, it is d cubed dp. Okay, so then dq/dp is how much the quantity change in price, right? So then dq/dp, economists sometimes have a slightly different measure instead of dq/dp that is more useful in economics, which is then you take this and multiply it by the price divided by the quantity. And the reason to do this is, I guess you could probably rearrange this. So let's say that it's in the that it's in discrete terms. So instead of d, we're using a delta. So delta p over p. And then we have delta q over q. And then this is just the relative change in quantity divided by the relative change in prices. Sometimes it'll be put as the percent change in quantity over the percent change in prices. So, for example, if the quantity increases 1% and then you divide this by maybe the price changes 2%, then the elasticity would be 1/2. So, make sense so far? And this is basically the reason why you do this is because then this is a much more useful measure in economics because it's dimensionless. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. You could be talking about cats or waffles or whatever the thing that people are buying is, and it doesn't change. Like you have an inbuilt automatically like sort of sense of scale, and you can actually get a sense of scale like this.
The average what? You cut out?
You there, Lime?
No.
Nope. Listen,
Can you guys
please.
hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, weird.
The stream is the.
Oh, yep. Let me Can everyone see again?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we're back. Yeah, a normal elasticity will be around 1, because this is going to be the elasticity for all goods and services when you think about it. Because if you have, for example, a 1% increase in the price of everything, then the sort of total amount of spending has to stay constant. So there has to be a 1% decrease in the amount of everything that is being bought, right?
Yeah, I was about to say the way you wrote this down looks like it should be negative.
Yeah, the negative will sometimes be dropped out of laziness, because it's almost always negative.
All right.
Yeah.
Can you ever have a positive demand curve?
Yes. Okay. So this is actually there is a term for that. If you have a positive demand curve, so there's two possibilities. First of all, the first one is called a Giffen good, and the idea of a Giffen good is that this is a good that is actually okay. I'm going to go over income elasticities first of all. So why am I drawing a curve? Really, just an income elasticity of demand. It's the same thing, except instead of using the price, we're using sorry, not the price. We're using the change in quantity with respect to the change in income, which is denoted Y traditionally. Why, I don't know. So this is it. This is the income elasticity of demand, and that's all it is. That's how it's defined. And there's sort of 3 broad categories that you can have for this, and they are, first of all, luxury. A luxury good is just something that has an income elasticity that's greater than 1, right? So that means that essentially when quantity increases a little bit, it increases the amount that you're spending a lot. So like maybe if there's a 1% increase in your income, you have a 5% increase in how much you spend on this good. And another way to think about it is that as you make more money, you begin to spend more. You begin to spend a larger percentage of your income on this, and that sort of makes it clearer why we call it a luxury good. Then there's necessities, and a necessity has an income less than 1. And same sort of thing. As you make less money, you spend a smaller percentage of your income. The most common example of this is food. And then the last one is what's it called? So we can have an inferior good. So an inferior good has one that's less than 0. So I should put between 0 and 1 for a necessity. An inferior good is basically a good that is like when you make more money, you spend less of your money on it. And the most common examples are sort of like knockoff versions of things. So maybe like those. So just it's like maybe you buy like a really crappy car instead of the nice car that you wanted to buy, because you can't afford the really nice car that you wanted to buy. So as people begin to make more money, they stop spending money on crappy cars because instead they're buying like very nice cars. So now there is one way for a good to have an upward sloping demand curve. And the way for it to be like that is for it to be so incredibly inferior that when you raise the price of it, people actually become like physically poorer in real terms because the price of the goods that they're spending money on has gone up. And so when you think about it, their real income, like their income adjusted for inflation, has gone down. And the example that's sometimes given is potatoes and the Irish potato famine. When the price of potatoes went up, because people were spending sort of like more than half of their money on it, this was essentially like if you just dropped their income. And when you dropped their income, then they couldn't afford more expensive goods to eat. The most common one was meat, for example. These families then would just stop buying the meat, which means then that you have to make up that calorie deficit somehow. So they would buy more potatoes to make up, like, and be able to afford to continue eating. So when the price of potatoes rose, possibly this you would have this increase in quantity because people would substitute away from meat and towards potatoes. The thing is, there is an argument about this because nobody has ever managed to prove that a Giffen good exists. It is something that completely makes sense in rational utility theory, and it's just like, yep, that could be a thing. There's not a problem with it. But it's like when you think about it, it's a very rare situation because, first of all, you have to have this good has to make up a very large percentage of your income. Like maybe you're spending half of your money on it, something like that. Otherwise, if it's like 1% of your income, then when the price goes up, that only means like a very small change in your actual income, in your real income. So the income effect is very. Wasn't there a Nobel rewarded for showing that rice in certain countries behaved as a Giffen good a few years ago? I'm not sure about that. It's possible that somebody's managed to figure out a way to show that one good was a Giffen good. But in any case, the broader thing that this is generally an extremely rare thing because you need people to be spending a lot of money on this good, a huge fraction, and that they need to be also very very responsive to changes in the price. It still holds. So these goods are very rare. They're very difficult to find examples of. So in general, I'm going to say we can sort of just like pretend for now, like for an introductory microclass, that this good doesn't exist. That there's no such thing as a Giffen good. We're going to pretend for now that all goods have downward sloping demand curves instead.
So they're missing.
So there was a
like a Giffen. A Griffin. Bad pun. I welcome the tomatoes in chat. Sorry, go ahead.
So the way you described that situation, it sounded like it was the price of all things in society versus the quantity of this one good, which.
Oh no! It's the price of this one good, and the idea is that if it's a big enough part of your income, then that one good raising price is in effect like if inflation went up, right? Because, like, for example, let's say that the only good that I bought was potatoes. I spent 100% of my money on potatoes. Then a 1% increase in prices means that inflation has been in the price of potatoes means that's a 1% inflation, right? If instead we think of this as like you have potatoes going up, like only being 50% of my income, that's only half of the money that I'm spending. Then a 1% increase in the price of potatoes is like a 0.5% inflation. It's like the price of everything. but it's still like a very large fraction of my income, so it means that I have less real income. Does that make sense?
So, all right. Bringing inflation into it kind of confuses me. But could we think of it as I'm spending X amount on potatoes, and then maybe I'm spending a bit on meat, but then the price of tomatoes goes up a bit. I no longer can afford meat, and I have to replace that with more potatoes.
Yes, that's exactly the right idea.
Okay, but the me not affording meat isn't that the price of meat went up or anything. It's just that I have less spare income for luxury goods, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly the way to think of it. Okay. The other theoretical example is what's called the Veblen good. And the Veblen good, the idea with it is that as price goes up, also you have quantity going up, because this is almost like the exact opposite of a Giffen good. It's a good that is so considered such a luxury that when the price goes up, people want to buy it more because it's a signaling good. It's a good that people are buying for purposes of sort of showing off. So maybe it's like a Rolex watch, and if Rolex watches were really cheap, nobody would want to buy a Rolex watch, because that would be sort of a that would no longer be a status symbol. It would no longer be a way to show off that you're rich. So that's the other example. Also very rare. Been very difficult to show that there's an example of it, and the main reason why is because if you can increase the price of something and sell more of it, then you would have already increased the price and sold more of it. Companies, like if you have a Veblen good, it'll usually be something more like this, that you have it going up and then down, and then companies will always price somewhere along this part. Because like if you made Rolex watches like infinitely expensive, then they have to start going down again at some point, right? Because like at that point people just can't afford them. Like nobody, not even like Bill would be able to afford it if you made it $80 billion. So prices will always companies, like if they are able to do so, will always tend to set a price at this part of the demand curve, because over here, whenever you raise it, you're making more and more money, because you're always you're selling at a higher price and you're selling more of it. So they'll tend to keep doing this and get back to this part of the demand curve, and then they'll stop at some point around here.
Why don't they stop at the apex?
Because then at this point it's possible for this to still be worth it. Like maybe the price will increase a little bit more, but if you increase the quantity a little bit more, it's possible like this area maybe is bigger than this area, and so you're still making more revenue by raising the price even further. I'm sorry, by increasing the quantity even further, by selling a little bit more of it. Maybe that's actually like still worth it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but it's just on this left half, it will never make sense to stop, because you can raise the price and it'll always be worth it. It could theoretically be at the apex, I think, but I think that you would have to go down like straight down pretty much. But it's like it doesn't make sense to be on the left half.
So a company controls both Q and P here, how many they're making and how much they sell it for?
If they are, the place where it can exist, a Veblen good, is if you don't have a monopoly on them. But it's very weird to get a Veblen good when you don't have a monopoly of any sort, because then the price of it will tend to be driven down to whatever the components are, for reasons we'll talk about when we go into perfect competition.
Okay.
So I think actually I will just stop here. We've gone on long enough. I'll be putting the homework in the description. Next time we'll be talking about equilibrium and taxes.